Imagine waking before sunrise to the sound of shouting outside your village. At first, you think it's another argument between neighboring communities, but then the shouting turns into screams. Homes are set ablaze. Armed men rush through the streets. Families scatter in every direction. Parents lose sight of their children. Brothers are tied together with rope. Those who resist are killed where they stand. By nightfall, the village is gone. The survivors begin walking, not home, but toward a coastline many have never seen. Some will march for weeks, others for months. Many will die before they ever reach the ocean. And those who do will discover something even more terrifying waiting for them. Ships. Over the next 4 centuries, more than 12 million Africans would be forced across the Atlantic Ocean. Millions more would die before ever reaching the Americas. Entire kingdoms would rise and fall. Fortunes would be built. Empires would grow rich. And the modern world would be shaped by one of the largest forced migrations in human history. But the Atlantic slave trade didn't begin with chains or ships. It began with something much simpler: demand. To understand how millions of people became commodities bought and sold across oceans, we have to go back to a world before the Atlantic trade even existed. Because history's greatest tragedies rarely begin with a single decision. They begin with hundreds of small ones. Slavery was not invented by Europeans. Long before the first Portuguese ships sailed down the coast of Africa, slavery existed across much of the ancient world. In the Roman Empire, prisoners of war were enslaved. Across parts of Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, different forms of servitude already existed. Some enslaved people eventually gained freedom. Others became soldiers, administrators, or even influential members of society. But these systems differed enormously. In many African societies, slavery was not based on race. People became enslaved through warfare, punishment for crimes, debt, or political conflict. Enslaved individuals could sometimes marry, own property, or eventually become part of the communities in which they lived. None of this resembled the hereditary, race-based slavery that would later develop across the Atlantic. That transformation was still centuries away. So what changed? The answer lay thousands of kilometers away in Europe. By the 15th century, Europe was changing rapidly. Trade was expanding. Kingdoms were growing stronger. Merchants were searching for new markets. And one small kingdom on the western edge of Europe was determined to find a sea route around Africa: Portugal. Under the patronage of Prince Henry the Navigator, Portuguese sailors slowly pushed farther down Africa's coastline. Their goals were straightforward: find gold, find spices, bypass Muslim-controlled trade routes, spread Christianity. At first, enslaved people were only one part of this growing commerce. Portuguese merchants traded for gold, ivory, pepper, and other goods, but they soon realized another commodity could generate enormous profits: human beings. The first enslaved Africans transported directly to Portugal arrived during the 1440s. At the time, nobody imagined what this trade would become, but another development would soon transform everything: sugar. Today, sugar is so common that it's easy to forget it was once considered a luxury. European demand exploded during the 15th century. Sugar plantations first flourished on Atlantic islands such as Madeira and São Tomé. Growing sugar was brutally difficult. Fields had to be cleared. Cane had to be planted, harvested, and crushed almost immediately after cutting. The work was relentless. Planters needed enormous numbers of laborers, and they wanted workers who could not simply leave. Enslaved Africans became the solution. The plantation system perfected on these islands would later be exported to an entirely new continent: the Americas. Everything changed after Christopher Columbus reached the Caribbean in 1492. Spain and Portugal established colonies across the Americas. Soon afterward came England, France, and the Dutch Republic. These colonies seemed unimaginably rich: sugar, tobacco, coffee, cotton, indigo. Every crop promised enormous profits, but every crop demanded labor. European settlers were too few. indentured servants eventually earned their freedom. Many indigenous communities were devastated by diseases introduced from Europe, while others resisted conquest and enslavement. Colonial leaders searched desperately for another labor force. Their answer would reshape the Atlantic world. One question still puzzles historians and viewers alike. Why Africa? The answer wasn't simple. West Africa already possessed established trading networks stretching across the continent. European ships could anchor along the coast and purchase captives through existing commercial systems instead of mounting expensive inland campaigns. Many African rulers did not think of themselves as part of one united people. Political loyalties centered on kingdoms, cities, clans, and ethnic groups. Prisoners captured during wars between rival states were sometimes sold into slavery. European merchants exploited these existing divisions, but demand soon overwhelmed older practices. Wars increasingly became opportunities to capture people rather than simply defeat enemies. Firearms purchased from European traders strengthened kingdoms that participated in the trade, forcing neighboring societies to arm themselves or risk destruction. A devastating cycle emerged. People were captured to buy weapons. Weapons were used to capture more people. Entire regions became trapped in an arms race driven by overseas demand. The Atlantic slave trade was no longer simply responding to conflict, it was helping create it. For those captured, the nightmare had only begun. Many were forced to march hundreds of kilometers toward the coast. Some were chained together by the neck. Others carried heavy wooden yokes. Anyone unable to continue risked being abandoned or killed. Families were deliberately separated. Languages changed as captives moved farther from home. By the time they reached the coast, many had already lost everything they had ever known. Waiting for them were enormous stone forts. Places like Elmina, Cape Coast Castle, Ouida, and Gorée Island became gateways into a world from which almost no one would ever return. Men, women, and children were imprisoned underground for weeks or months. Darkness, heat, disease, fear. Above them, waves crashed against the walls. Beyond the horizon waited ships unlike anything many had ever seen. And soon, they would be forced aboard them. What happened next became known as the Middle Passage, one of the most horrific sea voyages in human history. As the heavy wooden doors closed behind them, the captives entered a world unlike anything they had ever imagined. For many, the ocean itself was terrifying. Some had never seen such an endless body of water. Others believed the Europeans intended to eat them. Few knew where they were going. None knew if they would ever return. For the merchants, however, this voyage was simply another business transaction. For the captives, it was the beginning of hell. The ships that crossed the Atlantic were designed for one purpose: profit. Every additional captive represented potential income. As a result, captains packed ships as tightly as possible. Below deck, people were forced to lie shoulder to shoulder on wooden platforms, sometimes less than 5 feet high. There was barely enough room to sit upright. The air quickly became unbearable. The combination of sweat, vomit, blood, human waste, and seawater created conditions almost impossible to imagine today. Disease spread rapidly: dysentery, smallpox, malaria, measles, yellow fever. Those who became too weak were often left where they lay. Others died, chained beside the living. Ship crews faced disease as well, but unlike the captives, they could move freely on deck. For the enslaved, there was no escape. Captains knew that a dead captive earned no money. So each day, many prisoners were forced onto the deck, not for freedom, for exercise. They were ordered to jump, dance, or march while still in chains to keep their muscles from wasting away before reaching the Americas. Some refused, others resisted however they could. Many stopped eating altogether. Crews responded with brutal force, using metal instruments to pry open mouths and force food down their throats. There were also revolts. Throughout the history of the Atlantic slave trade, enslaved Africans fought back whenever opportunities arose. Some managed to seize weapons, others attempted to overpower crews while ships were still near the African coast. Most rebellions failed. European ships carried firearms, cannons, and trained sailors prepared for resistance. Women, who were often allowed greater movement around the ship, sometimes played crucial roles in organizing these uprisings. Even so, the odds were overwhelming. Historians estimate that around 2 million people died during the Middle Passage alone. Many more had already perished before reaching the ships. Survival did not bring freedom. It merely marked the beginning of another ordeal. When ships reached ports in Brazil, the Caribbean, or mainland North America, captives were washed, sometimes rubbed with oil to make them appear healthier, and inspected by buyers. Families that had somehow survived the voyage together were often separated forever within hours of arrival. Auctions reduced human beings to numbers: age, strength, health, price. A person's entire life could be decided in minutes. Many were sent to sugar plantations in Brazil or the Caribbean, where mortality rates were so high that plantation owners continually demanded new shipments from Africa. Others worked on tobacco plantations in Virginia, rice fields in South Carolina, cotton plantations across the American South, or coffee estates elsewhere in the Americas. The work was relentless, from sunrise to sunset, 6 days a week, sometimes 7 during harvest. Punishments for resistance ranged from whipping to branding, mutilation, imprisonment, or execution. Yet even under these conditions, enslaved people refused to surrender their humanity. History often remembers slavery through suffering, but it should also be remembered through resistance. Some resisted openly, others quietly. Some escaped into forests, mountains, or swamps, creating independent communities known as maroon settlements. In Jamaica, Suriname, Brazil, and elsewhere, these communities defended their freedom for generations. Others resisted by preserving what their captors tried to erase. Languages, songs, religious beliefs, stories, names, families rebuilt traditions from dozens of African cultures, blending them into entirely new identities across the Americas. Yoruba beliefs influenced religions like Candomblé and Santeria. African rhythms became the foundation of musical traditions that would eventually influence jazz, blues, samba, reggae, gospel, and countless other genres. Even under unimaginable oppression, culture survived. Perhaps the most successful rebellion occurred in the French colony of Saint-Domingue. In 1791, enslaved people launched an uprising unlike anything the world had ever seen. After years of brutal fighting, they defeated French forces and established the independent nation of Haiti in 1804. It was the first nation founded by formerly enslaved people. Its victory shocked governments throughout the Atlantic world. If one slave colony could overthrow an empire, could others follow? By the late 18th century, something remarkable began to happen. Opposition to the slave trade grew. Formerly enslaved people like Olaudah Equiano published powerful first-hand accounts describing the horrors of captivity. Abolitionists organized campaigns. Religious groups condemned the trade. Ordinary citizens signed petitions demanding change. At the same time, slave revolts frightened plantation owners, while changing economic conditions led some politicians and economists to question whether slavery remained the most profitable system. There was no single reason abolition succeeded. It was the result of many forces working together: moral pressure, economic change, political reform, slave resistance, international rivalry. Each played a part. In 1807, Britain outlawed its participation in the Atlantic slave trade. The United States followed with its own ban on importing enslaved people the following year. But illegal trafficking continued for decades. The trade itself declined far more slowly than many people realize. Slavery remained legal across much of the Americas. Britain abolished slavery throughout most of its empire in 1833. France abolished it permanently in 1848. The United States only ended slavery after the Civil War in 1865. Brazil, the largest destination for enslaved Africans throughout the Atlantic trade, did not abolish slavery until 1888. By then, more than 12 million Africans had crossed the Atlantic. Millions more had died before completing the journey. The Atlantic slave trade reshaped far more than the Americas. Africa itself paid an enormous price. Entire regions lost generations of young men and women. Communities lived in constant fear of raids. Wars intensified as firearms flowed into the continent. Kingdoms rose through participation in the trade and later collapsed when it ended. Economic development shifted toward capturing and exporting people rather than investing in agriculture, manufacturing, or infrastructure. The consequences lasted long after the final slave ship sailed. When European powers began colonizing Africa during the late 19th century, many societies had already been weakened by centuries of conflict and demographic loss. The Atlantic slave trade did not cause every challenge Africa would later face, but it fundamentally altered the continent's political, economic, and social development. The Atlantic slave trade officially ended. Its consequences did not. Across the Americas, millions of descendants of enslaved Africans helped build nations while facing generations of discrimination, segregation, and inequality. Across Africa, memories of the trade remain part of collective history. Families still trace ancestors through oral traditions. Archaeologists continue uncovering forgotten slave forts. Historians still debate many aspects of the trade, discovering new evidence that deepens our understanding. DNA testing has allowed countless people to reconnect with regions their ancestors were taken from centuries ago. At the same time, the trade transformed global commerce. It fueled the growth of European empires. It helped finance industries that powered the Industrial Revolution. It connected Africa, Europe, and the Americas more tightly than ever before, through unimaginable human suffering. Understanding this history isn't about assigning inherited guilt to people living today, nor is it about reducing history to simple heroes and villains. The Atlantic slave trade involved kings and merchants, captains and sailors, politicians and plantation owners, resistance fighters and abolitionists. Ordinary people made decisions that shaped extraordinary consequences. Some profited, some resisted. Millions paid the price. The Atlantic slave trade was one of history's greatest tragedies, but it was also one of history's greatest lessons. It reminds us how greed can become an institution, how prejudice can be manufactured to justify injustice, and how ordinary human choices made day after day, year after year, can reshape the world for centuries. Yet it also reminds us of something else. People never stopped resisting, not in the villages, not on the marches, not aboard the ships, not on the plantations. Even in humanity's darkest chapters, courage survived, and so did hope. The Atlantic slave trade wasn't just the movement of millions of people across an ocean, it was the story of lives stolen, cultures transformed, empires enriched, and a world forever changed. Understanding that history isn't just about remembering the past, it's about recognizing how deeply the past still lives in the present. If you enjoyed this documentary, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments which chapter of history you'd like to explore next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.